Hello, and welcome to my implementation demo of a game I developed with my team, Zero Possession, a movement-focused first-person action platformer set on the rooftops of a future Tokyo. I'm Carter, and I was the sound designer and composer for this project, as well as implementing everything in FMOD Studio, and then into the Unity project. In this video, I'll be explaining how I implemented each of the sound effects and music pieces into FMOD, along with the various dynamic elements of them. All of these sounds were made using FL Studio from a combination of my own recordings, third-party samples, and synthesis, with some additional editing done in SoundForge Pro 15. For this project, I maintained and tracked each individual asset for the game via a spreadsheet, which the most up-to-date template of can be found on my website. Without any more delay, let's jump into movement first. Being a movement-focused game, footsteps and landing are two of the most important sounds that the player will be hearing frequently. Both footstep and landing events reference the same parameter in FMOD, movement terrain, and will change which audio clips play depending on which trigger volume the player is in. Each of the 5 terrain types has multiple variations, leading to a ton of variety in these sounds. In-game, all of the terrain prefabs, with the exception of concrete objects, have trigger volumes on them, set up to change the global parameter, ensuring that both footsteps and landing sounds will change on that object. In addition to terrain, footstep sounds are also affected by a parameter called player speed, which is a flat percentage of the player's maximum speed, and will increase the volume and pitch of the footsteps depending on how fast they move. Along with footsteps and landing, jumping, double jumping, and dashing all play frequently, and need to convey a sense of speed to the player. So, all of them use rushing air and wind. Due to the 3 being similar, I ensured to differentiate them enough audibly for the player to tell the difference in fast-paced gameplay. Similarly, the slide and moving fast sounds both need to convey a similar sense of speed to the player. Both of them utilize the same technique, having an initial whoosh, followed by a loop, which is then sustained until the event is stopped, upon which an AHDSR is triggered to fade out the loop. In terms of their composition, for the slide I used Ambience from a lake, and some sliding on dirt for motion, and for moving fast I added a pitch down delay to differentiate it from the other sounds. With combat being the second core pillar of the gameplay of Zero Possession, the sound design of the combat-adjacent sounds were the result of multiple levels of iteration to get them right. Starting with the player character's primary weapon, the sword, it partially being an energy blade, ended up requiring 7 unique layers to bring the sound together. 3 whooshes, 2 metallic sounds, and 2 layers of energy. Each layer has 3 variations, leading to over 340 unique combinations, all while maintaining the same identity. When hitting objects, there's a base hit sound, being the metallic elements brought louder in the mix, along with the layers for hitting objects in the world, being a kick drum and clangs, and for hitting enemies, which is layered with a kick drum, pumpkin guts, and some other juicy sounds. The players don't just have the option of using the sword, however, as some enemies drop a pistol, as well as the enemies using these guns against you. Like the sword, there's the traditional layers and energy layers to them, although the gunshots are only a few layers each. Also like the sword, there's a base bullet impact sound, which is then layered on with hitting environmental objects with a ricochet sound, or the juicier impacts of hitting an enemy. While only the pistol is in the game at this time, I had designed sounds for a shotgun and Gatling gun as well, and I'm going to discuss the latter briefly before continuing. The Gatling gun is set to loop until stopped when triggered, allowing for the sound of continuous fire without triggering it for each shot, as well as not prematurely cutting off the final shot. The fire rate can also be easily adjusted in the event to ensure it lines up with the visuals. To get the enemies to sound more brutal and violent, the voice lines were sent through an EQ and distortion to get a crunchier effect. With a lot of combat throughout the game, a lot of death sounds were needed to offer some uniqueness to each kill, resulting in nearly 50 death sounds from myself and another team member. The UI is incredibly minimal in Zero Possession, so this section will be fairly brief. Hitting checkpoints was something that the player didn't necessarily need a giant pop-up for, so there's a simple Koto stinger that plays when a checkpoint is reached. Dashing is one of the only pieces of UI in the gameplay, but having a subtle sound effect letting the player know that their dash has reset to accompany the visual indicator was necessary. Finally, hovering and selecting options both exist to provide feedback on menus, being clicky enough but with enough grit to them as well. Environmental sound design was a key focus of my efforts in this game to make it feel more lived in. As I mentioned earlier in the video, all environmental objects have materials associated with them to change the footsteps and landing sounds to make it feel more tangible. But in addition to that, objects like signs, lights, transformers, and the hovering platforms all have sound emitters just for a bit more realism. Completing the environment's atmosphere is the ambience. There are 2 independent loops being used, city and rain ambience. While there's nothing really in terms of implementation here that's exciting, I allowed for an easy trigger volume that applies a low-pass filter to the rain specifically, which adds the effect of occluding the sound of the rain when undercover. Needing an in-world justification for how the player starts and ends each level, we added a tram, and naturally that has quite a few sounds associated with it. The first sounds that the player hears come from the tram, namely the music, which I took heavy inspiration from the bossa nova usually played as elevator music for. Along with the music, there's also the idle sound of the tram's motors, sounds of the door opening and closing, with a ping when it opens, as well as a fairly modular event for the tram moving. Starting the event plays the start, fading into a loop, which is then held by a sustain until stopped, then the sound of it grinding to a halt plays. With the music for Zero Possession, I'll briefly touch on the composition before talking about the implementation. Being set in a future Japanese city, I relied heavily on traditional Japanese and Eastern Asian instruments, like the koto, shakuhachi, and the shamisen, alongside with utilizing the yo, akabono, and owado scales for an additional Japanese feel. To get the futuristic side of it, I mixed in heavy drone synths, many arpeggiators, and digital glitches, and when the intensity called for it, I added in electric guitars as well. The implementation of the music isn't too complicated, mainly being composed of static loops, but each level and the main menu had an original and different track. Level 1 had 2 loops, each with transitions which, when triggered, would fade out the music into a short transitional piece, then into the next loop. The challenge and master levels both used the same, simpler method, having an intro and outro piece with a loop in the middle, transitioning at any point smoothly using fades. Finally, let's touch on general mixing done for the game in FMOD. There are a ton of global parameters, but we'll start with isPaused, which simply checks if the game is paused, and if it is, it fades out the music, ambience, and all of the sounds except for the UI using EQ filters. It's all done gradually to make it feel like you're slowing down time in a way, and speeding it back up when you're resuming the game. I wanted to allow the player to isolate and control their audio experience, and a big part of doing that is through the use of volume sliders. I settled on the master volume defaulting to 75%, so it's not too loud, but still has plenty of headroom in case the player wants to turn it up. Along with the master volume, there are 4 other volume sliders in-game for adjustment. Due to volume changes not being linear, I used these curves to ensure that it scaled properly to the ear. Finally, the last audio setting to talk about is speaker options. Knowing that mono accessibility is important, as well as just enjoying the options allowed by this, I routed each of the mix buses to a 5.1 surround bus, which then has 2 additional returns, those being stereo and mono, and when changing the speaker options parameter, it changes the volume being sent to the respective return, remixing the game audio up or down in real time with 0 latency. This is a simple but very effective solution to do this in FMOD Studio. Thanks for checking out this reel. If you're interested in seeing more, feel free to check out my website or social media in the description for contact information. Have a good one.